Welcome to the panel on governance theory organized by the Smart Contract Research Forum, or SCRF, as part of the Smart Contract Summit. I'm Eugene Leventhal, the operations lead here at SCRF, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's panel. This is actually part one of the panel, as the conversation was just too good to cut short. You'll be able to learn more about the panelists and to watch the rest of the video for free at smartcontractresearch.org/t/620. We'll also include a link at the end in case you didn't catch that. And so with that, we'll go around and do some intros, then Professor Ellie Rennie will present briefly, and then we'll get into the moderated discussion.
Thanks, Eugene, for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm Josh. I'm a PhD student in computer science at the University of Oxford, where I'm really trained as a pure mathematician, but I also do a lot of research on online governance. In particular, I help run a research group called MetaGov, which does a lot of work developing standards and infrastructure for online communities and online governance, spanning the gamut from social networks to online games to, of course, the blockchain.
Great. Thank you, Josh. Next up, Michael Zarghum.
Hi, thanks for having me. So I'm the founder and sort of chief engineer, although also CEO of a research and design firm called Block Science. We do quite a bit of work on algorithms for a variety of social and economic platforms, mostly blockchain related, but not exclusively. My background is actually in large-scale distributed and decentralized resource allocation problems like large-scale logistics. For lack of a better term, it's the sort of old version of decentralized resource algorithms. If we say that blockchains and smart contracts are the new version of that, though I might argue that it's all the same thing and that we're just using new tools, awesome new tools, but no tools nonetheless. And I'm also one of the original founders of the Common Stack and an early contributor and member of the token engineering community, as well as a member of the MetaGov group that Josh alluded to. And I'm affiliated with the University of Economics and Business in Vienna. Sorry, long list.
No, it's important to cover all the accolades, but thank you, Zarghum. And next up, Professor Quinn Dupont.
Thanks, Eugene. So I'm an assistant professor at the School of Business at University College Dublin. But I did my PhD in information science at the University of Toronto. And before that, I did enterprise risk management at IBM. I did my postdoc at University of Washington. And these days, my affiliations are pretty broad. I work extensively with the IEEE. In the past, I've done some standard setting work with the ISO. I'm a research affiliate at UC London, and so on and so forth. And I've studied crypto broadly since about 2012. I wrote a nice little green book called Cryptocurrencies and Blockchains with Polity and a number of other articles and whatnot. And that's me, Quinn Dupont. Thank you.
Thank you. And next, please, Ellie Rennie.
Yeah, hi. So I work at RMIT University in the Blockchain Innovation Hub, but I'm also involved with something called the Digital Ethnography Research Center. And the reason why that's important is my research is really focused on trying to understand the people within these blockchain systems and how they interact with the software actors, which is what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. Would you like me to start with that, Eugene?
Yeah, please feel free to jump right in.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen for a moment. I'm going to trust that this is visible and that you will tell me if it's not. So, okay. one of the questions that we were asked to think about in the lead up to this panel is, what is governance? So I'm putting a definition here, which is that to govern is to structure the field of action available to others. I'm either paraphrasing or directly quoting Foucault here, I believe. But I think it's relevant from whatever perspective, theoretical perspective you're coming from, in fact. And as a qualitative researcher and someone who uses participant observation in my research methods, I'm always trying to figure out, so who are the actors in this particular system? And when we're talking about DAOs, we're talking about human and machine, in this case, software-based actors who are structuring that field of action, right? So, and from an ethnographic perspective, we want to try to understand the interaction and I suppose some of the power dynamics that are going on there too. So what kind of actor is a DAO? So Aaron Wright, in his recent essay, has a nice little description of a DAO, which is that code forms a cohesive network of hard-to-change rules that establish the standards and procedures of anyone interacting with or taking part in a DAO. What I quite like about this is that he is emphasizing how it changes the actions of people taking part. But of course, because he comes from a legal perspective, he does have this emphasis on this, on the rules, on the smart contracts. And for me, if I'm thinking of what is the function of a DAO, what is the software agent here, it is probably more like a bureaucrat than a lawyer. I don't think of it so much as the rules, but the thing that is enacting those rules. So it's providing services to a public with varying degrees of autonomy from that public according to rules that are set by the political principle, which is either the members of the DAO or it could be the founders who established the DAO prior to those people being brought into it. Which for me makes me think, how do we then assess this kind of software-based bureaucracy? And there was an essay written in 2013 by Francis Fukuyama, which I found kind of useful for thinking through this. I'm not entirely convinced, but I thought I'd throw it out there as a talking point at least, where he talks about measuring the performance of bureaucracies and the infrastructural power of bureaucracies as opposed to the despotic power of rules and rulemaking that goes on and influences what that bureaucracy does. So the two measures that he puts forward are autonomy and capacity. So in capacity, he's talking about the merit of that bureaucracy, for instance, its ability to extract taxes successfully. And on the negative side, it could be the corruption of the bureaucracy as well. And autonomy is the degree of scope to implement programs without direction from the political principle, whoever that may be. And I think this is a useful definition, really, when it comes to blockchain. Sorry, we're going the wrong direction there. Except that I would probably tweak it a little bit, where autonomy would perhaps include automation, and I think capacity would be the sophistication as well of that particular DAO and what it's used for and what it's doing. So if you've got low capacity and high automation, you've got some problems. Maybe the DAO was one of those examples. And where there's too many rules and low capacity, maybe that's where you kind of get clientelism, the kind of problems where people might be directing funds to close associates or even to themselves, and what's starting to be referred to as governance extractable value in various forms. The other thing I quite like about thinking about them as bureaucracies is that things like baby DAOs and minion DAOs, as they're sometimes called, we can start to see them as offices within a government department. So where a majority of a small DAO is owned by is representative from another DAO. So and how you allocate tasks to people with specific expertise to govern over a subset of issues. And then, of course, things like having large investors controlling a significant proportion of many DAOs has an influence over the wider system, which I think we also need to keep in mind that when we're thinking about DAOs, it's not just a singular DAO, it's the interaction of DAOs within a broader decentralized system that is also important here. As I mentioned before, allowing an entity to vote on its own proposal can be problematic. And I think that, the way that we think of DAOs and autonomy comes into this. So, of course, automation is only good with a high degree of capacity, and we need to consider where we're automating particular processes and functions and services, the extent to which the tasks that are being carried out are suitable for that. So another question that we were asked to think about, and I'm sure we're going to come back to this, is that what are DAOs? Should they be democratic in terms of the way I think of it, not so much the machine, but the people in this instance, and how we organize those who are directing the software-based actor? And I would say that bureaucracies existed under monarchies, not just democracies. And some bureaucracies were founded under authoritarian rule. Germany is an example that's sometimes given here, but are actually very high functioning now under democracies, whereas some which were started under democratic circumstances have been a lot messier as public or civil services. So the question then is, should DAOs be democratic? Probably not. And maybe things like an investment DAO should have a tighter control by a particular group of agents or founders, and that there are various choices that are going to go on here. But what I would say, and this is where I'm going to conclude, is that in decentralized systems, I do think that there will be a tendency towards democracy. And that is, I think of this in terms of the monitoring function of the democratic type of politics, whereby, and I love this quote from John Quinn, that and he uses this term monitory democracy, essentially to describe the various kinds of constellations of monitoring, auditing organizations that form sideways and downwards through the political system in the kind of complex society that we now have. So not just the state, there are various types of things performing that role. And I think DAOs are doing that within a decentralized blockchain system too. And he says, democracy recognized that although people were not angels or gods or goddesses, they were at least good enough to prevent some humans from thinking they were. And I think that what I love about that quote with respect to the conversation that we're about to have is that idea of monitoring, keeping check, and that this is the function of those of us who are within DAOs as members, influencing these bureaucratic software agents. So I'm going to leave it there, and everyone feel free to disagree with me or take this in an entirely different direction.
That's great. Thank you so much for presenting there, Ellie. And feel free to close the share. But yeah, I know Zarghum, I believe, wanted to respond with something on the democracy side to kick us off.
Yeah, actually, it's really more of a clarifying discussion, because I think democracy is often a term used in this space, but I think we tend to take maybe a sort of narrow view of it in the context of certain, rituals or procedures. Like we think of democracy as being, identical to there's a voting process, when I would say it's kind of important to, given the context that Ellie provided, to think of it more as like a strong feedback loop between the sort of, let's just say, the governed and the decision-making that governs or structures the field. And so when we think about it in feedback loop terms, the monitoring concept becomes critical, but so too does just the fact that the feedback loop itself can be present and ineffectual, or present and biased towards a certain subgroup. We talk about, wealth and plutocracy in this particular community. And I really want to take time to pause and say, like, democracy from a lived experience perspective is going to be more like feeling and actually having some way of feeding back information to the system in which you are participating. And so we don't necessarily need to say, it's democracy because it's voting. And in fact, sometimes it's voting and it's really not very democratic feeling.
Quinn, I don't know if you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, I'd love to. So thanks also, Ellie, for kicking us off. I think that was really illustrative. And I'm really glad Zarghum picked up so here's my take. So funnily enough, I start with Foucault as well when I think about conceptualizing governance. The other phrase he uses is conduct of conduct, but you have the slightly longer version there. And he says it like leads to this paradox, right? In the liberal West, right? We assume that liberalism asserts the sovereignty of the free individual, but then government, of course, requires the individual behavior be regulated, modified. And so I thought what was really interesting about your take was that you really started at a political perspective, right? It was very much a manifestation of politics. You said it provides services to a public. And then I kind of think that as at the very top. Then there's a level down, which is where I kind of conceptualize governance. And I think of it as really much more in organizational terms. So I think it's a form of decision-making specifically for dealing with collective action problems. And there I really pick up on the language of Elinor Ostrom and finding the place where at least good governance has an opportunity to chart the waters between a simple market and the problems that simple markets provide. Markets are great, but of course they lead to all sorts of abuses and inequality and so on and so forth. But of course, there's sophisticated markets, which we would want and what things like DAOs could use. So neither a simple market nor centralized government, right? And so it's the in between. And then, of course, and this is where I'm so glad. I'd love to hear more from Zarghum and maybe Josh as well. And then there's the level that's down below, furthermore, and that's mechanism. That's as a mechanism, right? So you got the political, some sort of organizational framing, and then you've got the mechanism or maybe system or whatever kind of term we want to use there. So I just as a reflection, as sort of seeing these different characterizations.
Josh, please feel free.
I love somehow that we're on this Foucault kick, and I almost really want to go down it. But I'm gonna temper and be a little bit more humble and go with something that I know a little bit more about. I guess like this idea of DAOs as a form of administration is kind of, I don't know, it strikes me as a little bit off because I guess in my interactions with DAOs, I almost perceive them as a barrier to administration or a barrier to proper administration, which is like, I have an organization and it's making decisions and like in very few cases does the actual DAO infrastructure, the technical infrastructure that we call the DAO, i.e. the smart contract, which is just a piece of technology for administering collectively administering some sort of wallet, right? Actually comes into play in the actual organizational administration, right? Like, it glances off of that infrastructure, but like, it's just a piece of thing you have to check. It's like almost like a form you have to fill. So in that sense, yeah, okay, it's a piece of administration, but it's not like the administrator yet. I don't know. Maybe I'm giving more credit to administrators than is properly due. Yeah, maybe I'll just pose that there and question that definition of DAO.
Yeah, I suppose just in response to that, for me, it's what is the thing that's being automated and when we use DAOs. And we are people, we are not machines. We are decision makers. We are performing fairly well-rehearsed and historical roles within these DAOs that probably don't really need to be labored over other than they require a bit more coordination because we're doing them online and we're doing them across borders and often without identity, which makes it really bloody hard. So for me, it's more about, well, what is the software actor? Why is it significant? And what in the long run are we hoping that these things are for in a system of governance? So I agree with everything that's been said. It's more trying to account for how this network of interactions can be observed as an ethnographer. That's all. That's my only starting point. And yeah, I mean, putting Francis Fukuyama together with Foucault is an absolute crime for anyone watching. I totally get that. And I'm probably more on the Foucauldian side, but I did quite like that framework.
Zarghum, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I did. So I wanted to touch on two things from Josh and kind of tie it back to some stuff Ellie said. One relates to bureaucracy and one to automation and kind of relates them, or maybe anti-relates them. On one hand, like bureaucracy provides a sort of rather interesting low pass filtering or slowing action that actually increases the sustainability. So if you're talking about changing the field, the structuring or changing the field of play for others, you can imagine that can't change very fast. Like if it changed fast, it would lose most of its value to them. It needs to be able to change, but the slowing effects are not necessarily all bad. I know we sometimes think about, blockers or slowing or impedances to the administration of an organization as blockers from our own perspectives acting within that system and wanting to get done the thing we want to get done. But at a system scale, actually that impedance is as a desirable and arguably evolutionary trait of organizations because it keeps them from thrashing themselves out of existence. On the other end, automation provides a sort of the fast equivalent. So if something is sufficiently automated, then it's also reliable, but it's reliable in the sense that, it's real time or near real time. And you do the thing and you have a high expectation of its execution according to the sort of intended protocol or the intended process. And so weirdly enough, they're on opposite ends of the temporal spectrum, from very fast to very slow, but they both provide the same kind of net, let's say, effect on your lived experience, which is about consistency of expectation when you interact with something that's greater than yourself. And I think the reason I like to push on this is because ultimately, if we think of the DAOs or these organizations, as sort of greater than the sum of their parts, then you have to remember that the DAOs may have relationships to people, but we also have people's relationships to the DAOs. And one of the most important attributes for people's relationship to an organization they're within is some level of trust or consistency in that relationship. And so it's sort of an opposite of the desire to be able to make it do the thing you want because you want to do it.
Rich, you wanted to jump in? Still muted.
Sorry, I'm vaguely hesitant to raise the topic and feel free to shut me down. But one of the challenges I've had in this space over the last few years is that the word DAO is a euphemism and everybody brings a different definition of that word to the table. And I want to sort of clarify that for the purposes of this discussion, when we say DAO, are we talking about, is it a slow committee? Is it a co-op? Is it an organization of individuals? We have some form of treasury management, some form of polling mechanism for decisions, and some form of communication channel? Or are we talking about something that's a little more aspirational where there's rules and regulations and guidelines that are sort of been codified into another contract that speak to the mission of these organizations? Does that make sense?
I suspect everyone might have their own answer. I'm happy to.
That's the tricky part.
But I generally think of them, I wouldn't say aspirational. I would say that DAO as a term, both decentralized and autonomous, are like historically political terms, and you can look up their sort of canonical definitions. And if you think of them as adjectives modifying the word organization, then you're just talking about an organization where the power does not reside in a single group. It's, spread out amongst the political actors, which is maybe about what's inside of it or the power relation within it. And then the autonomy relates to its power relation with others. So it's, again, relatively autonomous in the sense that, you wouldn't anticipate anything other than its internal bits providing most of its agency. But that's still very much a kind of academic approach, I would say. And it's really just taking the terms at face value in their sort of historical political context, rather than trying to use the term the way that I say, like people are attaching meaning to it in this space.
Also, though, I think there's a spectrum for what is a DAO. And many of them right now may have a voting system or deliberation forum, but who actually signs off on those decisions is probably 4 people in a Gnosis safe or something like that. And therefore, I still think that they are DAOs, and we probably need better tools. And I think some are emerging around how to keep those particular power holders accountable. But yeah, I think the DAO is a system of inputs from various people, and even within DAO, there are these microstructures of who has more influence than others. Quinn.
Yeah, thanks, Ellie. I want to pick up on your comment around this continuum idea, right? I think that's correct. I think there's a continuum between sort of utopian idealism and really the reality. The reality tends to get ground down by law and regulation, right? And this is a conversation we could have about what that means. Everything from where you're going to domicile this thing to what kinds of laws might support it or make it difficult, so on and so forth. But sort of more abstract from that even, I think we're also in that sort of continuum between idealism and realism. There's a bunch of cultural expectations that we just bring to the table. We often don't even necessarily think about them. And I think 2 really important ones are transparency and granularity, right? Because there's no reason for a DAO necessarily to be transparent, but we tend to think of it as like there's some insight about how it's functioning, and that people can control it and do things with it, right? In granularity, right? Like this is one of these classic challenges around everything from direct democracy to various forms of organizational structures, right? Everything from a classic, hierarchical company to one that's very, very horizontal or whatever. And those are important decisions that one needs to make when constructing these things. And then, of course, our software tools enable us really sophisticated opportunities for both transparency and granularity, right? You can do all sorts of exciting things using markets, auctions, and so on and so forth, and voting, whatever, and all these kinds of things to make those very, very efficient. But those are really just, I think, cultural expectations that we bring to the table.
And Josh, I also want to make sure to give you a chance to respond in case there's any other elements of this before just before zooming in on a certain aspect of what's been covered in just how variable the definitions can be, and trying to think of, well, what are the characteristics that differentiate a set of people working with a set of smart contracts? At what point do they become a DAO? And sort of where might the line be drawn there?
I guess I have relatively little say because I find the conversation kind of necessarily inconclusive. I guess maybe this is just another way of saying it is just look at it empirically. Who calls themselves a DAO? How is this language used? If you just collect all the DAOs, you'll be able to see probably a fairly obvious pattern. And then that will be essentially the sort of continuing definition of a DAO. I guess the more interesting thing that I think Zarghum hinted at is this, or so both Zarghum and Quinn sort of were leading into, is this distinction between formal and informal governance, or what Quinn sort of described as granularity. And it's kind of interesting to me because if you look at the, how do I say it? Algorithm is not quite the right word. Maybe the UX, with a sort of the design of most DAOs, it kind of inscribes a certain kind of process for how to interact with it, how to get money out of it, how to sort of send things, right? But the actual pragmatics of this tool are still very much evolving and kind of unknown to most people that sort of start using this technology, right? And it's sort of just saying you can give. I was just having a conversation about this, which is why it comes up. But if you're registering a new nonprofit, right, you can get the algorithm. You can this is step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. People write up in paragraphs. You can see this everywhere. But that doesn't show you the lived experience of how this is actually how you start a nonprofit. These are this is all the sort of weird decisions you have to make and the conversations you have to have. And the same thing kind of applies for DAOs. And I feel like that's a really good point that Quinn was making about this granularity, that like we really don't totally understand like, what exists at that level, or that, it's still not really properly documented, which is why I think it's still so incredibly important that, people like Ellie and her team are doing this work of like, really going in and seeing like, how are these things actually getting used, and can we write that down somewhere?
Zarghum, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I want to use, and I think some of you guys have heard this kind of thought experiment before about DAOs, but I'm going to make a point about the difference between using the term DAO and sort of like the actual concepts that the terms bring about. And in this example, we're going to say that we have one organization that calls itself a DAO, but that does it for largely regulatory arbitrage reasons and has a small, sort of multi-sig that, while ostensibly holds votes or discussions, they like kind of they exert a degree of sort of authority over everyone's opinions and or like largely just, gather the support they need to push through proposals that are, again, largely sourced from that group. And although that organization may use any number of smart contracts and tools to facilitate the administration of these processes, the power is still very clearly centralized. But if you looked at the data, you would see that they call themselves a DAO and that they use these smart contracts and there's some level of participation, yada, yada. And then you might have another organization which uses little or no tooling, and maybe at most they have a single smart contract that is a multi-sig that manages their funds, but then they use, Discord and Discourse and a variety of other tools to create like a productive and highly democratic, consensus building exercise where lots of different people contribute ideas, and you can see the evolution of the proposals to meet multiple stakeholders groups' needs, and then it gets, again, like administrated by, okay, the stewards who have the keys of the multi-sig go and, push the buttons, perform the ritual, say distribute the funds or enact the code change. And in doing so, they maybe don't even call themselves a DAO, or maybe they don't feel like they get to because they don't have all the bells and whistles and the tooling. But from, maybe from a first principles perspective, they're much more DAO-like, or maybe it's better to dispense with the term entirely and just like assess those two organizations for their attributes. And I use this example in part because there's actually almost no way to tell them apart, or worse yet, you might interpret them in the opposite if you weren't doing ethnographic work, if you weren't going in and talking to the members of those communities and asking them questions about their experiences and the extent to which they feel heard or empowered. Because by the data, just by the code and by the metrics, it would look like the first one was really decentralized, but it's not. And the second one would look really centralized, but it's not. And so I really think it's important to actually use that to show how much the data can't tell us, at least the raw data that's not been complemented by ethnographic work.
If I can jump in, I think that's a really important insight, and which is why I think hierarchical structure is not a great metric for thinking about what a DAO is. Zarghum, you mentioned the word governance, so let's return to that. And we've got a good number of options available, and that we can sort of think through. The one that we all know, of course, is open source software governance. The tagline is rough consensus and running code, right? That doesn't necessarily have anything to do with, what we would characterize as a DAO-like structure, right? I mean, it can be actually kind of benevolent dictator type of stuff. On the other sort of extreme, we've got corporate governance, right? IT management. How does like a standard company make an IT change, right? Sort of change management type functions in a corporation. And so I think probably what the sort of important differentiator comes around how that governance itself functions, right? And how that consensus comes to be. And this goes to, Zarghum, you mentioned it, right? These are how these inputs get in onto the system. How is it? What kind of structures are they using there? I think we have a relatively narrow range that do tend to be used today. They tend to be, well, broadly speaking, things that can be economic, really.
And I want to take this opportunity to maybe quickly go around and clearly articulate what each individual is thinking when they use the term governance, because that itself is something that, as we've already heard in different contexts, can mean slightly different things. So it would be great to kind of just go around, whoever's willing to jump in first, and kind of give what they view as their working definition of governance, given the context of this conversation.
I mean, I'm happy to. Sorry, Ellie, go ahead.
No, go ahead, because you can.
Mine's simple. I think I already said it. I think it's conduct of conduct, and I think specifically it has to do with decision making for collective action. I think because it's not about one person, right? It's governance. That's know thyself, right? So it's about a collective, and fundamentally, it's about how you come to make decisions. That's what I think.
I agree with that, and it then becomes, well, is corporate governance all we need for this new form of organisation? And my colleague Sinclair Davidson actually has quite a nice paper on this up on SSRN, arguing that corporate governance is sufficient. And I think in many instances, in many kinds of DAOs, it is probably sufficient. I think what we've all been also thinking about is what we've been calling informal governance, and the types of social coordination that go beyond rules and how important they are within these systems. So, and to me, that is also governance, but that is more how the rules that we create influence what we do and don't do, even outside of that formal structure. And that's very, very clear to see within blockchain communities, that they develop their own ways of working. And I think this becomes particularly important around issues such as expertise, and who not just who is voting, but who is taking the lead within particular areas of a DAO, and how I think, how do we then start to recognize that, encourage that where it works and where it's useful for that organization, or find ways of shedding light on processes that are less ideal, particularly where decisions are occurring behind closed doors in private Zoom calls, and then just pretending to be brought to the forum spontaneously in a democratic way.
Josh, did you want to jump in?
Oh, sure. I guess I can go first. So I thought I'd give a definition that hopefully will make Zarghum proud. It's a little bit dynamical systemsy, but the rough motto, the short version of that is governance, kind of writ small, is about control. So like sort of changing the behavior of systems. And governance writ large, following what Quinn mentioning, is about collective action. But the kind of a way of thinking about this is that another way of sort of thinking about this is to say that governance writ small is really about the input-output behavior of systems, right? But governance writ large, when we talk about collective action, it's also about systems, but it's really about what we might think of like the local to global properties of systems. So if I have a sort of like a local system, right, over here, and then I sort of like, compare this, or sort of like start gluing this together with other pieces, like, locally, the system might have some sort of property or preferences, but like, what does that look like when I start gluing all these other pieces into a bigger whole? Does the preference information change? Things like that. There's lots of questions that you can sort of think about in this like local to global context, but I'm just saying these are two very different ways of thinking about governance, and this kind of gives you a way of reasoning about the sort of the relationship between them. in the context of a single system.
Thanks for tuning in to the first half of the discussion on governance theory. If you want to see the rest of the panel, if you want to learn more about our panelists, or if you want to be part of our long-term discussion on the topic, check out smartcontractresearch.org/T/620. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of the summit.